Okay. Yep. I'm Aaron Sorensen. Nice to meet you guys. It's awesome. I have a lot of the community coming out saying hey. And it's been awesome to meet a lot of you. So to start, I'm just going to show my reel.
I'll take you for a drive. Here to stay and die. The color of the golden light. I'll give it to you. I close my eyes. I don't wanna escape.
Okay. So yeah, that's just a little bit of some of my work. No, thank you. Yeah. So I'm a generalist. So I kind of wear a lot of hats. My end goal is I always want to make something look cinematic and really cool. And C4D has been my weapon of choice. I've been using it for years. It's an awesome tool. A lot of guys here use it for motion graphics, but I use it in a different way. I like to use it for VFX and compositing. So today we're going to be talking a lot about using it for those types of projects. So just a little bit about me. So I am the creator of VFXCentral.net, where I create digital assets for VFX artists. So explosions, flares, I film some, and I create my own as well. We also give away a bunch of free VFX to the community, and we are coming out with some training, and we'll talk a little bit about that a bit later. But yeah, so go check out VFXCentral.net. Currently, I work at a company called The Void. Has anyone heard of The Void? Okay, yeah, so it's a location-based VR experience. We've been working with Sony and Disney, and we have Void locations around the world. So it's really cool because you can go in with a group of 4, and everything you see in VR you can feel and touch. So we have haptics, the ground shakes, you have a vest. It's really immersive. We have smells, everything else. You guys will have to check it out. If you're in downtown Disney or Disney Springs, you got to try the Star Wars one. It's pretty awesome. So yeah, go try out The Void. And there I am a senior VFX artist, so I work on anything that is public facing. So you see posters, you see our videos. We have videos that play before you go in the experience to kind of help tie in a lot of the story elements, and I work on all that stuff. And C4D, again, is a huge part of our pipeline. So here's just a couple images of, this was downtown Disney in Disney Springs. It was the craziest experience when I worked on some of this stuff, coming around the corner and seeing some of your artwork there in Disney. It was really awesome, kind of a dream come true moment. And I used Cinema 4D on a lot of my artwork to create all this fun stuff and show it to the public. So just kind of cool. And Cinema 4D, again, it's been a huge help. With that, here are some of the programs I use. So Cinema 4D is major. I've been learning some 3D coat stuff. Redshift for my rendering, and I've used Octane as well. Photoshop for some paint over stuff, and I like to use Nuke to composite it all together, and DaVinci for some coloring. So those are my weapons of choice. And just here's a little image of something, matte painting I did. This I rendered in Cinema 4D. I used the projections, and I had proxy trees, and then brought it all together in Nuke. So yeah, you have the tools to be able to create some really cool stuff with cinema, and so just thought I'd share some of that. Before I begin, I want to show just an embarrassing clip, but I just thought it'd be kind of inspiring to see where I started and tell you guys a little bit about that. When I was really young, before I understood about After Effects or anything like that, I used to export out every frame out of iMovie. Every frame, import it into Photoshop, Paint, next frame, Paint. I was dedicated to making cool stuff. And I just want to show you guys a totally embarrassing clip of when I don't even know what age I was. Yeah, this is how rad. This is some of the cool stuff I made in cinema. Oh my gosh, look out. So photoreal. Hate when robots land on cars. Oh my goodness. Yes. So guys, there is hope for you. This is just some stuff I would make, and it was pretty janky, but it was my beginnings, and I just always wanted to do the VFX stuff. And Cinema 4D was so intuitive. The interface, everything was, it just made sense in my head. And so for me as an artist, it's been super awesome, and they keep developing and adding more and more amazing stuff in it. So before I begin as well, I want to talk about my workflow, and hopefully this is just some things that will help you guys out in your projects. I am a small team. There's like me and like a couple other guys that do the VFX. And so for me, I've had to streamline everything in order to make things work properly. So I always like to start with tracking or animation. I feel, and I'll get into why a little bit later, but the tracking and animation is essential to start. This is a huge time saver. Once you've locked in the animation of either your camera or characters, it's going to help you dictate, you know, how you're going to light something, how much you need to model, how much you need to even texture. So it's good to make sure you're starting with your animation. I'll do like white boxing, where I'll have simple geometry, animate a camera, and then bake it out. Once the director or whoever's in charge, the creative director, is happy with it. Then we go into like modeling. So then I'll start replacing some of those lower polys with some higher, nicer looking assets. And then I'll go into texturing and making them look cool. I like to then do a first one lighting pass. And I do this first lighting pass to help me dictate how I'm going to do my matte painting later. This way, if I have some 3D geometry in my scene, it'll look like it's being lit properly along with the matte painting. So that's kind of what I do, is the first lighting pass, like the one where I have like the big directional light, whether a sun or whatever. Go into baking animation once we're happy with that. And then projections, projection setup and matte painting. So again, why I have the animation is one of the top things you want to have approved, is because once you start doing projections, you project from certain frames in your camera animation. And if you start changing your animation, it's going to start messing up your projections, and it can get messy really quick when you're doing projections. So you want to make sure you are baking and finalizing all of your camera animations. Then after that, I will go into the simulation side of things. And the reason why I do this after, for me, is because I have found that my matte paintings can actually help a lot of my lighting and compositing. What it will do is, if I have a simulation on the ground with a projected texture, it will actually illuminate and light some of my simulations, giving me a little bit more photorealism in my renders. So that's kind of how I've worked that in there. And then I'll do a final lighting pass. So sometimes there's just some things that just maybe aren't looking right, and we want to tweak those things and kind of make them feel like they're set in a lot better. After that, we'll do a setting up AOVs or multi-passes. So this is just setting up your reflections, your diffuse, your Z-depth, your object passes. These things are going to help you guys in your compositing, bring it all together and make those final adjustments. And then render. So I use Redshift. C4D has an amazing pro render engine. There's a physical render engine, Octane, Arnold. There's many tools for that. So I prefer to use the Redshift in my workflow. So now we're going to jump over into Cinema and talk about some cool tracking stuff. So does anyone, do you guys know, who knows that there is a tracker in Cinema 4D? Yeah? Oh, right on, right on. So there is a tracker in Cinema 4D, and they just updated it. I'm going to be using the R19 version, but the R20 version, I went back there and played with it. You guys, it's so fast, and they've improved it big time. So you'll have to go check out the tracking in R20. It's pretty awesome. So we're just going to go through tracking a shot. And what you do is go up into the motion tracker. And over here, it's going to ask us for the footage. So we'll just navigate to that. Let me just make sure. Here it is. OK. All right, so here's our footage. And this footage is actually from my course that's going to be coming out, where we take this shot and we build a whole scene with it. And actually, maybe before we start, let's just show you the preview of what we're going to be creating to kind of give you guys an idea of what's happening here. So let's open this up. So start it over. So this is the shot we're going to be creating. This is what I created in Cinema 4D. is you have this shot on a green screen, the camera does this nice cinematic pan up, and it pulls backwards, and we have that environment completely projected. So it's I just like to make things look as cinematic, like as if it's from some movie. So, and you can do it all in C4D. So yeah, just fun stuff, and I'm going to show you how we're going to do that. So I want to talk about tracking in general before we kind of get into the tracker. When you're setting up your footage to be tracked, you want to make sure you do a couple of things to help out the tracker. So a tracker, it looks for points of contrast, and it'll make all these little points where the contrast is, and then it will run through an algorithm, and it'll calculate each point and how they're moving with each other. And that way it'll find out the parallax. So it's like, okay, this point's moving this fast, this one's moving this fast, and from that, it can calculate how the camera's moving in our scene. So we can help it out a little bit. And a couple ways is first denoising your footage. If you have noisy footage, it's going to have all these flickery things happening, and what's going to happen is the trackers are going to jump around, and that can be problematic. So denoise your footage, and then I actually will do a new sharpen or an unsharpen, and you can change the radius of your sharpen. So we're not sharpening teeny details, but maybe you want to sharpen larger details so we can make our tracker markers even more contrasting. So what it will do, and if you look at this tracking marker, it's hard to see. I'll turn up the samples on this a little bit, is when you do an unsharpen, it will actually make almost like a halo around some of your tracking markers, and that's going to also just pull out that contrast. So that's just a little tip on when you're setting up your footage for tracking. And now let's talk about the motion tracker. So the motion tracker is really rad. Obviously, you import your footage. You can import your lens profile if you have some of that stuff. And this slide right here is the sampling. So if I turn that up, we're going to get a sharper image. But sometimes it's better to use it at a lower resolution so it's faster. The other nice thing about this interface when you're in the motion tracker is you can zoom in and you can pan around, and it's not moving a camera, it's using as a 2D plane. So we can move around and look at things, and you don't have to worry about ruining your camera perspective. So that's super helpful. And now let's start talking about the actual tracking. So if you click on this next dialog after footage, 2D tracking, they have first this auto tracker, and this auto tracker is awesome. And one of the first things you can do is set up the number of tracks. So it's going to look for 300 and the minimum spacing, so how close they are. And what we can do is I'm just going to click Create Auto Tracks. And immediately, it's looking for those points of contrast that we talked about, and it's finding it all around our scene. So we could turn this number up, first hit delete, and turn this maybe up to like 400, and it'll just populate it a little bit more. But again, we want to make sure we're hitting those nice contrasting values. So I'm going to turn the spacing down a little bit, and try that again. And now we can see it's concentrating some of these points a little bit better. So the next thing I want to talk about is looking at what to track. So tracking can be interesting because you are trying to solve a movement of the camera. We don't want to solve his movement. So in here, the fun thing is you can go in and select all of the points on him and just delete them. So now that it won't track his movement, and we don't have to worry about that. The other thing to look for, which I used to make this mistake when I was younger, is tracking reflections. So sometimes the tracker will make, and we can see on these stands, it's making points because it thinks that these are nice points of contrast on the stands, when really these points are moving reflections. And so it's kind of deceiving. You have to realize that as our perspective changes, as I scrub through the footage, some of these reflections, especially down here on this mat, they're going to move because reflections move based on your perspective. So you have to be careful when you have reflective objects, and it's best to just select them and anything that's reflective and clean them up and get rid of them. So once you go through this whole process of removing reflective tracking markers, you're going to have to start adding back in some tracking markers that it can be confident in. So I would hope you guys would do this better than I would, but I'm just going to delete a couple of these, and we're just going to do this really quickly, just at some that I know are going to break, and maybe we'll just do the running, we'll run the tracker. So with using the tracker, there's a couple different ways to do this. Is because we're at frame 1, we could hit this track forward, and it's going to track all the footage going forward. If we were at the in frame, you could track backwards. In between, you would do the auto tracker, and it will track it both ways. I'm going to start at the first frame, and we're just going to, I always just like to hit the auto tracker because it's a habit, and it's just going to go through. And if we look down here, it's going to process those frames so you know it's running through the tracker. And while we're waiting for this, again, I was going to say, if you guys get a chance, go back and try out the motion tracker for R20. It's very fast, and it does a great job. I tested it with this footage and didn't even delete some of the like high-moving tracker markers, and it was able to pull off a track. So it's really cool. So now let's just scrub through this footage, and we can see now we have all these points, and they have these little tails on them, and that is telling us the path or the movement of the camera. And we can see some of these are sticking really well, but some of them aren't. And so you'll have to go through and obviously clean up some of these if they're sliding. So it is it can be kind of tedious, but you do have to do these types of things when you are tracking, just to make sure it's solid. I'm going to leave this for now, and I'm going to get us a little bit more information for our solver. So we can go into the manual tracking tab next. In here, we can create our own tracking markers to help out this auto tracker a little bit more. So if there's points that we saw that didn't get a tracker, for example, this marker that missed out, we can zoom up on it, and if we hold Control and click, we can create our own tracking marker on this. And this box right here will look at the contrast value. So whatever's inside this box, it'll try to determine the luminance contrast value. There's different in this tab, there's different color channels you can have it look at for contrast. So we're in luminance. There's a red channel, a green channel, a blue. So this can help you guys out when if you have maybe two colors that are contrasting each other very well. So we're just going to leave it on the luminance. And because we are at that in frame, we can just hit track backwards. And let's just start scrubbing backwards and see how it did. So we can see it sticking. It's looking pretty good. And we can see that tail, it held in there very, very well. And it's good to have these manual tracks because, again, these are going to be the most confident tracking markers to help your 3D solve. So this is looking really good. It does break near the end, and we could help it out even a little bit more by making another keyframe just to give it some confidence. So I like to just grab this box and move it a little bit, and it made a keyframe down here, and now we can see we did extend the life of that tracker just a little bit longer before it gets cut off. So you'll have to go through and make all these tracking markers, manual tracking markers, just to make sure that we're giving it enough information. I'm going to run the 3D solver, and we're going to see how it does, but we just did one manual track and a couple of auto tracks, and so the next thing we do is head over to the 3D Solve tab. In the 3D Solve tab, we can do a full 3D reconstruction, a nodal pan, or a planar track. We're just going to run the 3D Solve, and it's going to run through and create a bunch of points for us. The other thing is if you have all the lens information, like when you're on set and you take note of all of your camera data, focal length and all that fun stuff, you can put it in here, or you can have it try to solve it. So we're going to say unknown but constant because we're not zooming or anything like that. And we'll just hit Run 3D Solver. So we can see down here it's going to run through. It did finish, and we'll see what kind of thing we got from this. We'll see if it pulled it off. So it only did it on a couple of frames because we didn't give it enough information, and we can see right there. So it got it to this point, and then it stopped. And that's because we just didn't make enough manual tracks, but you can go in and make more manual tracks to help it out. So I'm going to pull up another project that I tracked fully, and we're going to discuss the next steps that we take. So let's jump into this shot. So now we have this solved camera, and let me just show you what all these little point clouds look like in here. So this is the same shot that we had, and now we have it keyed out. Let me also turn off the camera displays because that's okay. So this is the camera move that we have in the shot, and we also have this guy keyed out, and I'm going to show you how we did that as well. So once we're happy with our solve and it's looking nice, what we can do is we can jump out to a different perspective, and I'm going to show you what we've created here. Let's turn that camera back on. So here is our solved camera, and we can see it has all those keyframes baked in, and we can see the path of our camera. And what I did is I took a plane, just a simple plane, and I put it as a child to the camera. And the reason why I did this is so that this plane is always auto-orienting towards my camera. After that, I took this footage that we have right here. I did a key. I went in After Effects. I pulled a simple key, and I rendered it out as a PNG sequence with RGB and A, so with the alpha. So the color and the alpha channels all in there. And so we have the luminance as the color and the alpha channel in there as well as an image sequence. And make sure that you're going to the animation tab and hitting calculate, and it'll make sure that you have all your frames in there. Then what we're doing is we are projecting from our perspective, that baked camera. We are taking this material, putting it on the card, and now we are projecting that keyed footage on this card. So this card now has this solved camera in there. And we'll get into the projection stuff a little bit more, but that's essentially how I had that, and that's how we're able to get this keyed out version of our guy. And then I animated the card just a little bit in Z space by eye to kind of figure out roughly where he would be in 3D space. So now there's some fun things we can do with this. So I work on some smaller budget stuff, and sometimes we don't have enough to maybe do a huge epic shot, maybe one where the camera flies back and does something crazy. But we can do this in 3D, and I'm going to show you. This is a really cool technique. For example, in some movies, you'll have a camera that's flying through a city, a CG city, and then it'll come up to maybe a window, and it'll slowly push in, and then it transitions like perfectly into a shot. And this is a technique that I'm going to show you guys now, which has been kind of a cool thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new camera that is a child of our baked camera. So if I click on this solved camera, and we're just going to go create this new one, so it created right here. And if I click on looking at it through that perspective, it should look exactly the same because we're in the same perspective view. Now we're going to drag this as a child to that solved camera. So let me just jump out and show you guys what is happening. And let's see if I can maybe make this a different color so we can tell the difference between the two. Right now they're all laying on top of each other, but once I start moving it, you'll see what's happening. So this camera that I have selected that's a child should be moving exactly the same, and we see that it is. And now we have a lot more creative control with this shot. What we can do is we can start animating this a little bit. So maybe we want this shot to start, panning down, and we see his feet walking in, and we do a slow pan up and reveal him. So we could start this first frame. Before I do this, actually, I'm going to make a keyframe to lock in that position, because once you zero out this camera, it's going to be exactly the same as the baked camera. So let's just make a keyframe right there at frame 59. And the frame 1, we're going to have the camera looking down and hit keyframe. And I'm also going to change this from spline to linear. And let's look through perspective and see what this is doing. So now we have this pan, but it's also still moving with our tracked camera. So that was just a nice, simple little move that we did. We just added a little bit more. And let's get a little bit crazier with this. So let's go outside of that. And let's say after there, let's have this camera, I wanted this to be a really cool crane shot, maybe flying back and revealing the landscape. So let's just take this camera and let's fly it back. And maybe have it go up a little bit. And I'm just going to make a keyframe at the very end. And let's look from perspective and see what we got. And we also can have him, let's just have him center framed, maybe at the bottom, and make a keyframe. Another helpful tool in the camera settings is if you go over to composition, we have these really helpful guides, and this will help you compose your shots, put them in the thirds or whatever. They have all of these really helpful things like the golden spiral. This is just a great thing to help you kind of guide your audience's eye of what you want them to see. So yeah, now we have this shot that's kind of craning up. So let's go back to our first frame and see what this looks like. Got the nice pan, and now slowly this camera's pulling away from that track camera, but it's still gonna, there'll be little motions that are still gonna be the same. You can push this too far where it will start getting distorted, but there's just little subtle things you can do to make it look like you had a larger production than you did. Just a helpful little tip there. So now that we have that and we're happy with this animation, we need to bake this animation. And I'm gonna show you something that I learned and that a mistake that I was making in the past. So if I duplicate this camera, so it's the same camera, and we go up to our, let's pull up our timeline. And let's say we want to bake this camera, we're happy with the animation. Well, if I pull this camera into here and I bake it, there's going to be an issue. And I'll show you. Let's just hit the bake objects and all. So, okay, bake the camera. And at first it's looking good, and it's like, okay, I think this thing worked. But once I pull this camera out of here, I'm going to show you what happens. So now the camera it's not moving properly because it was just a child of the baked camera. So that's a problem. So we got to figure out a way for this camera to be baked and take on the attributes of its parent because it is a child. So what we need to do is we need to give it a new parent. So the first thing you can do is go in and create a null. And then, again, I'm going to duplicate this camera just so we don't lose the way we animated this. So we have this new camera. And we're going to, let's make sure it's looking the same as well. And let's drag this into this null. So now it is a child. And now we're going to use the character tags and do a constraint. So this is going to help it be parented to its original solved camera. So we just click on, let's go to the parent, and now we need to tell it who the parent is. So click on this tab right here, and it says target, so it needs something to look at, and it's that solved camera. So now if I hit play on this, it should look exactly the same, but we have it outside of the solved camera. So that's looking pretty good. And now we can go ahead and go up to our dope sheet, and let's drag this camera in, and let's bake this animation and see if it worked. So it made a copy. And so far, if I toggle between these two, yep, it's working. And let's pull it outside of that null, and it should still be looking great. Perfect. So this is how you bake that animation like we talked about in the workflow. It's making sure you're baking your animation, the director's happy, everyone's happy, so you don't have to go backwards. Now we can move to the next step, which is projections. So let's jump over to the next project where we will be doing some projection. Has anyone used ProjectionMan? A couple of us out here? Yeah, ProjectionMan is an awesome tool, and we're going to show you some cool things that we can do with this. Let's go in and turn off the camera. All right. So here is that same baked camera. Now I have this environment that I created. Camera's kind of pulling back and doing some cool stuff. So in ProjectionMan, we need to give it some frames to project from. And this is where you want to minimize as many projections as you can. So I want to choose a frame, a first frame to project from that will cover as much of this environment as I can. So let's go up to the window and open up ProjectionMan, and we'll just have this dialog here on the side. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on this plane that we've created, these kind of mountain landscapes, and we are going to project on that. So make sure that's selected and that we are in the right perspective. If you are in a different perspective, it will bake from that perspective. So we got to make sure you're in the right view and then select what you want to bake. So we want to bake on this polygon. So I just click on it, and we see it's highlighted over here. And we're going to go to Camera, New, and we're going to do a coverage render. So I just click on this, and we need to choose a place for it to save. So we'll just save it here. And you also want to name it what frame you're projecting from. So we can see that I'm at frame 52, so I'm going to name it frame 52. Hit save. And then there's a couple other options in here. So obviously the size, and we want to save an alpha channel. We can also do a straight alpha. And I'm also going to do this draw edges. So this will look at our polygons, and it will have all the lines. So if it's a flat render, because right now it's just checked on that constant shader, we wouldn't be able to tell where like hills are. So I'm going to do the draw edges, and we're just going to hit OK. So immediately you can see it open Photoshop, which is really cool. So this is the render that we have, and this is just a reference for us to paint over. So we're not going to use this as the projection. We're just going to use this as a reference so we know where things are. So let's check out what happened in Photoshop. And here is our file in here. Now I'm going to open up my project that I've painted, and we're just going to move it over. Let's just open frame 52. Okay, so this is a painting that I did very, very quickly. And I just did these kind of mountain ranges. And this one, it was the same where I had, there was my render, like so. So this was a really nice guide to be able to match up my hill. And if I turn down the opacity, that was another nice way to be able to see where these hills are lying. It wasn't perfect, but it was good enough. And you also want to make sure, because right here it's kind of clipping. So you have to make sure that your geometry is a little bit bigger than your painting because you have an alpha channel. Otherwise, it'll be clipping. You can adjust it in C4D later and move some of your polygons. So I'm just going to, this is already saved, and we're going to go back over into Cinema, and we're going to load up that map painting. So if we go to the plane, right now it is using the other project, so I'm just going to load a new one really quick. So let's just click on that, make sure frame 52, the plane, and if you already had something that you painted at the frame, this is how you do that. New projection, load bitmap. Let's go into our projections, find the one that we painted at frame 52, and right here it's going to ask for what layers we're going to use in Photoshop because it uses the Photoshop layers. So we want to use that hill, which is that front one, as the luminance channel, and we also want the hill's alpha channel, and we're just going to hit OK. And now we can see that it is loaded onto our object. One thing that you have to do is turn off your reflectance. And just so this looks a little bit nicer, I'm going to turn up the resolution. So we can see, this is why I like ProjectionMan, is it creates a camera from that perspective. In the past, before I understood ProjectionMan, I actually would take my self camera, delete all the keyframes, because I didn't understand the power of ProjectionMan, and I would just make sure it was that one frame. But ProjectionMan will create a new camera, and it'll lock it so it won't move, because we're projecting from that camera's perspective onto the geometry. So let's go back and look through our baked camera, and we can see if we toggle between that frame 52 and the camera, because we haven't moved, it's exactly the same. Let's go to the very beginning and hit play. So we can see now we have part of our environment projected right there on our geometry, which is looking pretty cool. So you can tell by the end that it's not looking right, and we're going to show you how to solve that. So the other thing you want to do is I actually like to turn on this. This is on the material. This right now it's projecting from the front, but sometimes if you have some geometry where we're seeing the back sides, it's good to do both. And so now it's completely transparent. Anything that isn't a part of that alpha is transparent. So that's just a little tip right there. So let's do one more projection because we can see as we got to here that it's cut off. So this is another reason why I really like the ProjectionMan. So let's go to the end frame because we're pulled back far enough, and we know how much it's going to cover on that, and we're going to do a nice paint over. Make sure your plane is selected again. Go back up to camera, new projection, and we're going to do a coverage render. We'll just click that, and again, rename this. Make sure your naming it what frame you are working on. We'll call it V2. And I'm going to draw the edges as well. Okay, so it just launched Photoshop for us again. And the cool thing is we can see our previous projection. So we can figure out where we need to blend these two. And what I'm going to do, we're going to do a little bit of cheating, is I'm going to take my previous matte painting, and I'm going to drag it over into this project, which is figure out why that's okay, and make sure bounding boxes are on. So what we can start doing is we can line up this same environment, and you know what, maybe we'll just flip it as well. So we can just start playing around with this thing. I would hope that you guys would do a better job than I'm going to be doing right here, but I'll just kind of show you what I'm going to do. So what we'll do is line up this hill, and we can turn the opacity down and look at where this mountain is lining up, and we think that that looks pretty good. Hit enter. Let's turn the opacity back up. I'm going to create a mask, and we're going to just kind of paint out some of this stuff in here and make sure. There we go. There we go. So yeah, we're just going to paint out some of this stuff. There it goes. And change. All right. Let me just grab the lasso tool. Hopefully you guys would do this quicker than I am. And I also wanted to make sure that my brushes are out, because the cool thing is you can have a nice soft blend. So it does use the alpha right in there. So we're just going to blend these two. And this is what we're actually projecting. This is a patch projection. So we're just adding a little bit more from where it was clipped. So now we can just save this. And let's go back over to Cinema. Now I know that we click right here on this plane, and we're going to specify which layer for the luminance and which layer for the alpha. Now previously I did have something happen with this that didn't allow it, so I'm going to reload this one. So again, click on the plane, new projection. Let's go back to this perspective and frame, plane. Going to reload that same one that we just did. There we go. Hill. There we go. So now we have this patch projection, and we will turn up the resolution. Let's take a look. And now we have this cinematic shot pretty quick. And again, what are the advantages of doing something like this? Well, I've noticed in my renders that anything that's reflective, if I have another object in here, it'll start seeing those reflections as in our environment. And sometimes you can fake it in post. You may do like a nice render and then add in the background later. But you miss out on a lot of really good reflections, and also reflections in like based on distance, because sometimes 3D objects, when they use reflections, it can tell if there isn't depth to it, because things reflect differently on perspective. So this is just a really good way to help you guys get those more photorealistic renders. So the other thing we can do is we can start adding things like a sky or whatever on this image. So we're just going to do that really quickly. And I believe if we do it if we pull the camera back, we can actually add our own a projection from this perspective. So if I wanted to pull back, we can see that's what our projection looks like here in Cinema. And the cool thing is we're getting that nice depth. And you can go in here and mess with it even a little bit more. And one of the ways I like to do that is play with the magnet tool. So I can go in here and use the magnet tool. So if you know that there's a certain ridge that maybe is protruding a little bit more, the fun thing is you can go in here and start manipulating this just to give it, you know, more accurate parallax. Because the way the camera is going to move, you'll start seeing that parallax in some of the mountains and the hills. So that's just a super helpful way to be able to get that detail. So let's try to do another projection from this perspective, maybe for a sky. So I'm just going to move the camera in right there, select this other plane, and we're going to do another coverage render. And again, name it. This one's just going to be like just a coverage. So we're just going to name it that. Okay, so yeah, I didn't bake in the other camera. I should have added the other object in there. If I selected both planes, we'd be able to see both. But in here, we can start painting in or adding in our sky. So let me just grab that sky element in our other project. It's a lot of layers going on in here. So I know in here I made this sky. So we're just going to grab this sky element, and I'm going to bring it into this project. And we're going to scale this thing down. Let's just move this thing into place. We'll do this pretty quick. And, I mean, we didn't necessarily have to do it this way. There's different ways you could do this. And let's go back into Cinema. And, again, I think we have to reload that sky because it did not like that. So let's do that really quickly. Camera. It'll ask us our alpha and luminance. And there we go. So let's go back into our baked camera and take a look at this shot. And like I said, this is just such a helpful way to be able to figure out how you're going to create your scenes. And I did mention that it is good to have your lights set up, like if you had a sun or whatever, and make sure you have your lights set up before so that you can kind of see how your light's going to be hitting. So in this instance, I would want this light right here to be casting shadows across. Let's just turn on the shading. So you could angle your area lights or your sun to be hitting in a certain place, and this way it would help you figure out how you're going to do your matte painting in this particular scene. So let's just I'm just going to move this light around really quickly. So you'd maybe want to do something like this before you jumped into doing your matte painting, just so you could figure out how this matte painting is going to look and which direction the light's coming from. So let's jump back over to the final shot. And once you get your lighting, your materials, and everything set up properly, and I did the lighting, like I said before, on this project, because I knew that where he was going to step through the light, and then I did a lot of the matte painting. This isn't the final shot, and I do have a course coming out, which I'll show you guys some of that. So I do have a course coming out at vfxcentral.net where I talk about using Redshift and doing this exact project, but adding a lot more. And it's called the VFX Crash Course. So if you go to vfxcentral.net, you can sign up to be notified when the course comes out. And here's kind of what we go through. We do the pre-production. We create a concept art with Photoshop, and then we do an animatic using Cinema 4D and Octane. And this will help us plan for our production and how we're going to shoot it. So then, once I create these nice animatic, these camera movements, that will help us figure out how we're going to light our scene on production, and that's going to be a huge time saver. Then in production, we do a whole lesson on what to look for as a supervisor, as a VFX supervisor, measuring distance from your talent, making sure that things are lit properly, trackers are set up properly, and then we just go into all that fun stuff in post-production, which is tracking, animating. We use Cinema 4D and Synthesize. Then we do sculpting, texturing an environment with 3D Coat and Cinema 4D. Then we light and render using C4D Redshift. And then we do all of our compositing in Nuke. And a lot of people, I don't know if anyone here is a Nuke compositor, but we also can teach you guys how to use Fusion, just node-based. And I talk about the difference between compositing in something like After Effects versus compositing with a node-based compositor, and I kind of help you guys make that transition to get those photorealistic composites. And lastly, we talk about in this course, getting and working with clients, something essential that a lot of people don't talk about, especially if you're freelance. It's important to work with clients and keep a good relationship, so we have discussions on that as well. If you guys are interested, I'm on Instagram. I'd love to get to know all of you a bit more at VFX_Central. And I have a YouTube and Twitch channel where I do live streams, and I do a lot of educational stuff, training on Cinema 4D, Redshift, Octane, compositing, and I'm trying to be more engaged with the community and figure out what the things that they're wanting to learn, which is why I created the course that I have coming out, because I have seen a lack of the full production on how things are done. So, yeah. And don't forget to check out vfxcentral.net. Thank you.